And have a little introduction, or
We're starting now.
okay, happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day. So this is a Valentine to send out into the world to send some love to future generations and people outside, and introduce them to Chuck Andersen and his way of thinking about the world.
Yeah, and I'll try to come across with some feeling stuff too, not just thinking, but starting with Valentine's Day, I think that's appropriate.
Well, let's start there then.
Okay, happy Valentine's Day, world.
Happy Valentine's Day to you.
Happy to be here, happy to be alive, happy to be able to share, and I'm very grateful to Brian who spearheaded this whole thing. So onward we go.
Onward we go. So let's start not quite at the beginning, but let's introduce who is Chuck Andersen to the world. So you are a California native,
I am a California native,
born and raised in Orange County.
born and raised in Orange County.
You've lived your entire life in Anaheim.
Lived my entire life in Anaheim, except for when I was in the Marine Corps.
And what did you do when you were in the Marine Corps? And when did you serve?
I served from 1971 to 1977.
6 years.
Yep.
And that was during the Vietnam era.
It was basically the end of the Vietnam era. It was coming to a close when I got drafted. But went in the Marine Corps instead of the Army. Okay.
And what did you do? What was your job while you were in the Marine Corps?
I made liquid oxygen. I called a cryogenics equipment technician. I stood next to a jet engine and brought in tons of air that turned it into liquid oxygen.
That's pretty cool.
It was really cool. It was like minus 350 degrees, so pretty cool, but very technical.
It's very chilly for a February day. That might not be an inappropriate theme, even though Valentine's Day is designed to kind of melt our hearts a little bit. So, speaking of hearts, who is your Valentine?
My Valentine is my wife, Maria, who we're just a few months short of being married 50 years.
Well, that is quite an achievement.
Gosh, it's her achievement.
Well, and as with all relationships, I'm sure, neither of you have come through this thing unscathed, but I'm certain there's a lot of lessons that have been learned along the way.
Well, when I was a young person, younger than you, I used to ask people who'd been married a long time, what's the secret? And they always said, almost to a person, it's not always been easy. There's a great truth there.
Sure.
So, this is not an easy path for anyone. So all of you are struggling with your Valentine world, I wish you all the best.
Well, that's great. So, 71 to 77, you served in the Marine Corps. And that was your full-time occupation at that point in your life?
No. I was in the reserves.
Okay.
I had an active duty period twice, and then mostly was going to school, but going to school too.
Going to school, and you went to Cal State Fullerton.
Cal State Fullerton.
You graduated from Cal State Fullerton with a degree in
Music, bachelor degree of music.
Well, what could anybody possibly do with a bachelor's degree in music?
Well, I created a music business. It was a music consulting business for churches, and I served up to 4 churches at a time, working with them, coordinating their music programs and hiring the right people, and trying to make worship an enriching experience for everyone.
Absolutely. And what was the process that you utilized in trying to connect that celebration and bring it to people?
To go deep. My calling, I felt my whole life, is to just get below the surface and see what's really going on. And the rituals and the celebrations that we participated in are ancient things that touch the deepest part of our human being. I went to a week-long, well, we'd call it a convocation probably, of how to make baptism. See, baptism is a big part of the liturgy, and how to make that meaningful for the people who are going to the baptism. And in that period of time, I discovered Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell said, it's through fire that we enter the realms of original experience. And on that week-long period, that's what we got people to do, to enter into the sacred mysteries through fire. And it is so powerful and touched me so deeply. And I tried to take that depth and share that in all the things that we do. I don't get a lot of cooperation in that because people are resistant to the idea of mystery. So here I am. Phew. We're doing multiple levels sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you mentioned trial by fire, and that concept of a crucible goes back a long way. One of my personal favorite books is Job, A Comedy of Justice, written by Robert A. Heinlein.
Science fiction writer.
He's a science fiction writer, but in that particular journey, the protagonist is on a cruise, and they're in a tropical setting, and there's a fire walk, and he walks through the fire and finds himself in an altered reality, parallel universe, where some things are the same, but everything is completely upended. How does that translate to your feelings on going through the fire?
Well, fire is one of the most primordial experiences we have. I was at the ocean the other day, and we were just watching waves, and watching fire and watching waves are some of the most captivating things I did as a child, and I still find it so as an adult. That it's a conjunction of both memory and imagination. It isn't daydreaming. A lot of people think daydreaming is a waste of time, but I'm one of those who think it is the point of time, is to bring this all together into consciousness. And when we lose ourselves in those moments of reverie, the revelations that come, I turned into an idea called Soul Solitude.
And that's a book that you've brought out into the world.
That's a book we brought out into. I co-wrote it, and what it does is it takes the idea of just not slowing down, but stopping. Just reverie is really the point, because in the journey of becoming deeply human, we leave a lot of stuff behind. And the idea of the subtitle is taking time for the soul to catch up. Well, the soul is encumbered with a lot of memory and a lot of reactions that we've had to the things that we've encountered in life. And when we take time for the soul to catch up, we get to reintegrate ourselves with parts of ourselves that we've forgotten, parts of ourselves we've abandoned, and parts of ourselves that we hope that we'll discover or learn to live in one day. So,
sounds like quite a journey. So, being that this is our introduction, let's kind of rewind just a little bit.
Okay.
In between when you wrote Soul Solitude and when you founded your church music business as a consulting practice on liturgy and faith, you've also pursued higher studies as well after years of being in business. So I'd love to chat just a little bit around that and kind of set the stage for the formulation of the experience of your own journey. And, if you can just provide us with kind of a brief timeline from a 10,000 foot view of what that journey looked like. Was it a linear and a straight path to get here? And the entire purpose of this video is to introduce the concept of Mythogenics, which is one of your own creations, to the world, and to start illustrating and outlining and informing around that. So within that context, can you talk a little bit about, what happened from your journey from being a student, graduating in music, going into a consulting practice and working with churches, and anything else you've done that led to your journey to go pursue your higher education, and what's brought you to this point?
Yeah, well, I alluded to the fact earlier of Joseph Campbell and the idea of entering the realms of original experience. I discovered Joseph Campbell, as did millions of other people, in 1987 when he introduced with Bill Moyers the idea of the power of myth, and that myth wasn't just old stories that people told with quaint notions of how the world came about, but that mythology and mythic thought and mythic consciousness even are part of the fundamental part of being truly human. So it was the discovery of Joseph Campbell, and I discovered that in the same time that I was working deeply in biblical studies and learning that the narrative qualities of the Bible stories were structured very deeply, and that mythic structure is a very significant part of all storytelling. And that I thought, well, let's find out more about that. And I got into liturgy, Catholic liturgy, particularly in the idea of storytelling. And Joseph Campbell was basically the guide. And so I, in the early years of 2002, 2003, I engaged in a program of study at Pacific Graduate Institute on mythological studies.
I'm sorry, what was the name of the school again?
Pacifica
Graduate
Institute.
Graduate Institute. And that's up by Santa Barbara, correct?
It's in Carpinteria, actually, and it's a wonderful setting to study in, and to be. It's right next to the ocean and right next to the mountains, and it was just wonderful experience, but also difficult because one of the qualities I bring to my education and other things is I'm a bit of a gadfly. I analyze the obvious, and people get resentful of that because you think that if it's obvious you ought to see it, but in terms, because of the mythogenic thing, we're hidden so much from the mythological part of life. For instance, we talk about society. Well, society doesn't really exist in any formal structure or any place. It is it's a mythic construct or a mythogenic construct. And really what it is myth creates the world and the world creates myth. And it's in this dance that we learn to walk and live in our culture, which is, when we talk about American exceptionalism, that's a myth we tell ourselves about ourselves and believe it to be true. But sometimes there are times when we find out it's merely a myth. But one of the very powerful things about myth is it trumps facts. We learn this in elections, particularly. There's the facts that people tell, and then there's the myth that is told in opposition, and usually it's the myth that wins. This happened with John Kerry, for instance, in his election. He was a hero, but through the Swift voters, they used mythological methods to reduce him to a coward, which was, and I at the time was trying to convince people that he really was a hero, but he couldn't stand against the power of myth. And ergo the power of the book, Power of Myth. It has power. It has had power all throughout our history. When we look at the things that create change in the world, most of the time, it's a story we tell ourselves about who we are and what we own and our land. The Middle East is just bad storytelling for thousands of years. Okay. So one of the things that seems to me that Mythogenics is about is telling better stories. And so much of human relations is about the story of us, whoever we are, because relationship is the fundamental basis of the universe. And that's not an insight that's shared by a lot of people, but it's so obvious. We can't get around it. So trying to analyze the obvious for people, when I say that, society's a myth, a lot of people get very resentful of that.
Well, and I think that that's definitely worth diving into, but I don't know that we can do that without getting some depth behind this. So,
right.
In the interest of the introduction, when you went to Pacifica and you studied, what was the course of study there?
Well, it was called Mythological Studies.
Okay.
And it was Pacifica is a psychological studies school with myth as part of their curriculum. My degree is I have a master's degree in mythological studies with an emphasis in depth psychology. Depth psychology is basically Carl Jung and Freud. But I spend most of my study time with Jung and the idea of the subconscious. Now, not all psychological studies and schools of thought include the subconscious. Behavioral-based studies really fix the behavior. Don't worry about what's underlying that.
What's driving the behavior?
Yeah, what informs the behavior is oftentimes the mythic encounters we had as a youth. When I say mythic encounters, we fundamentally have encounters that we don't understand at the time. We're just confronted with issues that are shared by many, many other people growing up and developing in the world. These patterns can be studied and understood. Jung understood them, and basically he used a four-part pattern of basically extroversion, introversion, neurotic behavior, and what we call competence, which is like you want your brain surgeon to have a high level of competence. You don't want him necessarily being the conqueror of the world. Just fix my brain.
Sure. So it sounds like there's a journey there to get from Joseph Campbell to Jung along the way.
Oh yeah.
And reading into this, because this is not our first discussion around these topics by any means, you're starting with an audacious assertion in all of this that myth is not a dead thing that existed at one point in the past. We've talked about the Greek gods and Norse mythology and those types of things, but this audacious assertion that you're making is that myth is a living thing and it's current and it's affecting and impacting every aspect of our life every day. Is that correct?
Correct.
And is that the basis then of Mythogenics?
It's one of the bases of Mythogenics. Because Mythogenics is a tool for analyzing these things. We don't have many tools for looking at the mythological structure of life. One of the things that I use is, let's take the myth of Perseus. And Perseus had to slay the Gorgon, a monster. But the trouble with Medusa was, if you looked at her, you turned to stone. And if you turn to stone, you're not going to have very much of a life. But if Perseus decided to polish his shield, and so when he has his encounter with the Gorgon, he was able to cut off her head because he could see behind him. Now, this could be seen as a nice story, or gory, but a nice story. But it also has a deep psychological insight for those who have the willingness to see. Because the nature of ego is it looks out. It doesn't look inward. It's always looking for worlds to conquer and places to be, have impact and be important. But most of the activity that goes on in our life is over our shoulder. We don't really get to see it. So one of the things that mythology does is it provides that shield to help us to see what's really going on within us. So that's why the link between the psychology school of Pacifica and the mythological school. And I used to say that psychology has hijacked mythology because it's such a good tool. But it has its own legitimacy too, besides trying to do psychological work. Because mythological work is, it's in our metaphors. We have to face our dragons and our monsters. And, this is the subject of literature. And, let's take Moby Dick. On one level, it's a whale. But the way we look at it, the way Melville wrote the story, it's a great deal more. And that story gets translated into, I remember there's episodes in Star Trek about that, about being Ahab, the captain, being fixated on the whale. Well, we often do that in life. Not everybody, but many people will get a monster that they have to get rid of. And the idea of mythology and music too help us to create the environment that allows us to look inward and find out what the dimensions of that monstrosity is and what its impact is having in our life and how we might be able to address it. And there's what psychological help comes from. It's easier to see the inside sometimes through the eyes of another person. I'm not a practicing psychologist. I call myself a mythician, which is kind of more like a physician, but it's...
Or a musician.
Musician, mythician. They usually, but the idea of mythician is take two metaphors and see me in the morning. But it's the idea that through the use of mythic tools, conceptual and physical, fire would be one, we can enter into these places in the deep spaces of our own psyche, which is its own battleground. There are many different schools of psychology, and so Mythogenics' point is to sort of unify them in a sense of give common tools.
So, in order to do that, vocabulary matters.
Oh, yes.
And mythogenics is a new word in the lexicon of the English language. Can you walk us through the etymology of mythogenics and how you got to that phraseology?
Okay, I can't walk. Okay, there is in the dictionary, there are now entries for mythogenics.
Oh, are there?
Yeah.
I was not aware.
Yeah, and see, there's my personal etymology, and then whatever the heck is going on in the culture that created that is a common enough insight for Oxford or Webster or whoever it was that put it in there. But it's this mysterious thing that myth creates the world. The world doesn't exist. The earth exists. But the world is a myth that we tell ourselves. And that myth that tells us who we are forms who we are. You see, if you're familiar with the idea of an Ouroboros, that's a snake that eats its tail, and it goes in. So myth is creating the world or consuming the world while the world is being created to give us something to actually consume. It's a profound symbol from many cultures, and so Mythogenics is basically feeding your own snake.
And what is the practical purpose of feeding your own snake?
Keep going. Life is painful, difficult, and complicated, and mythology is one of the ways that people have characteristically been able to handle through our evolutionary path. It's, you know, we're not get out of this alive, and the people we love are going to get sick and die, or bad things happen to good people, and the where do we get the wherewithal to keep going? And that's the point of religion and myth and all of these things is really to address that fundamental pain of being human and being alive. And if we look evolutionarily, we see that it took the first burial site that we have where people took the idea of some future life and set the person, and there's 100,000 years ago, which is a long time. But in terms of the evolutionary path of humans, it took us a long time to start finding ways to console ourselves for this overwhelmingly difficult path that we find ourselves. And in terms of trying to, you know, you can't kiss it and make it better. You have to, which we'd love to do, but mythology holds it and consoles and gives us solace if we take the time to do that.
So, you brought up an interesting point here where you say life is difficult, painful, and complicated. That goes against a lot of the current
Positive thinking,
you know, armchair psychology of today about the pursuit of happiness and joy through, you know, personal achievement and mindset and focus and manifesting. You know, there's so many different components, you know, that are popularly being employed for people to try to address these issues. How does Mythogenics and that premise of life is difficult, painful, and complicated overlay to either rebut today's modern approach to the pursuit of happiness or to support it?
Well, you said words are important earlier, and see, the happiness is an unrealistic outcome because of the fleeting nature of life. You can have moments that are full of joy and full of, but in terms of a long-term consequence, you know, people in the pursuit of happiness, they get things that they want, and they wind up not wanting what they got, because it's a deeply spiritual issue, not just a matter of materialism. And enjoyment is part of happiness, but so is struggle and suffering. Because if you don't, you know, once you have gotten past, let's call it the desert that we might be in, there's the joy that you escape. But that doesn't stay, because there's going to be another chapter of the journey that brings up many of the same patterns that we experienced in the last chapter. So trying to get ourselves in a way that face the next leg of the journey, whatever it might be, with happiness, with joy, with pain, difficult, and suffering. I came up with a spiritual formula I call acceptance, gratitude, trust, and surrender. And those are the keys to well-being. Well-being is not happiness. Well-being is that when we accept the nature of life as it is, we don't make it worse. See, the trouble with if life is nature is painful, difficult, and complicated. When we try to make it simple and easy, we wind up making it harder. Because the number one thing to do is accept life on its own terms. We live it, and Buddhism and Christianity both have their primary engagement with suffering. Christianity, you pick up your cross and follow me. Buddhism is life is pain. Now that's the wisdom of ages. What passes for wisdom today is a little suspect, in my opinion, because it wants to enshrine happiness. You know, and like that's what we did with the Declaration of Independence: is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, it's the pursuit, not the attainment of happiness, that makes us because in mythic terms, the pursuit is quest, mission, burden that we have to undertake to get there with those elements. So people dispute painful, difficult, complicated, and I answer, well, acceptance, gratitude, trust, and surrender. They're impossible problems, so to accept things. For instance, I came from a very brutal and painful background growing up, and I have to accept that that's the truth of my life. I don't have to be limited by it. I can't get beyond it if I don't accept that it's true. That my parents didn't love me. But many people have that problem, and then they spend their whole life looking for that thing that will fill that void. It can be drugs, alcohol, sex, money. There's different ways people try to fill that hole. And one of the things that they fill it with is delusional thinking or magical thinking, that life isn't like it is. But if we accept life on its own terms, we find it in our hearts to be grateful. And this is where mythology comes in. To have an object of your gratitude makes a lot more sense than to just, oh, thank God. But to be grateful, and then to trust that it's all got a good end. There's a purpose in the universe. There's a nature that says evolution is not just a blind clockwork. The atheists and whatnot are very into that idea that there's no point to anything. Although when you see evolution unfold, it looks like it's got a point. What point might that be? Well, it isn't going to be inscribed in a holy mountain somewhere. It's in the heart, to find that point, and then to trust that that's good and well, and a necessary part of being, and then surrender to that, and say, I don't have any control over the universe. I just have to accept, be grateful that I'm on the path that I'm on. I can change paths, but that's not an easy thing to anybody who's tried it, will attest, I'm sure. So just how painful, difficult, and complicated that is to change the path that you're on.
I don't disagree with that at all. Being that one of the points of this project is to start to kind of catalog some of the journey, you know, to memorialize yourself and your life, and to connect that for future generations, as well as, you know, spreading more of this knowledge of these concepts that you've come up with into the world. It is important to talk about your family and where you came from. Not necessarily all of the messy details, but let's delve into that a little bit. Who were your parents?
Well, my parents, Andy and Laverne, were both alcoholics.
And that's something that certain members of our family still struggle with.
Yes, because it's genetic. And I fortunately am not, because I don't drink. And that's the only way I know how to dance with that devil is don't. But when you have, you know, I can't catalog all the ramifications of what two alcoholics in a family does. It's pretty crazy. You know, one of the things that you wind up denying your own experience, that it's gaslighting on steroids. Is that, you know, I remember one time as a kid, I'm dancing with my mom in the kitchen. We're just horsing around and I'm dancing, and she falls, and she gets up and her arm is in a great big S, and it's broken in two places. It wasn't compound, but every bell in my body was going, we gotta fix this. This is, and my mom said, "Oh, there's nothing wrong. There's no problem." Huh? You know, and it was quite an experience to get medical attention for a very severely broken arm. But she's all the time trying to convince me that this is not necessary. There's, you know, deny.
Sure. You know, and I think that's, I'm not sure whether it's a cause of or symptomatic of alcoholism in general, but you know, there's a tendency to try to escape reality. You know, you utilize the alcohol as a vessel to escape. It's escapism. Your parents, your mother was adopted, I understand.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as our family history, we still have question marks that are unresolved over where she came from. How has that impacted your growth and your journey as you were growing up? Her not having a family.
Well, she had a family. She was adopted, and so was her brother. And interestingly, both her and her brother were alcoholics. Now, I don't know what that has to do with the adoption process, but one of the things I know from knowing them is they had no idea who they were. See, one of the fundamental questions in human development is, who am I? If I can't say with some conviction, this is who I am in the world, it's like walking on gravel. You just can't get your traction. Walking on a hill on gravel, even. And so one of the things that is true for you and for me is we need to know who we are, but you don't necessarily learn that by yourself. One of the objectives of parents is to help their children understand who they are in a painful, difficult, complicated world. Not an easy task. I don't know how parents do it. You know, we had 6 children, and we were able to. You see, the jury's always out. One of the favorite expressions is from my youngest daughter when she was very young. It's never too late to be a disappointment.
And we live on that premise every day. Despite whatever perceived successes or accomplishments, it is never too late to become the greatest disappointment.
Well, because for instance, Eric, my oldest son, is a very accomplished lawyer. But what happened is he got ill. Nobody could see it coming. There's no rhyme or reason. It comes out of probably genetic stuff. But it basically snatches his career away from him because he's got this illness that's so nobody can actually specify it. And you see, and that's really one of the things, a diagnosis is a mythology. You know, see, I have 5 terminal illnesses.
And what are those?
Well, you had to ask, didn't you? Okay, I have a very severe coronary artery disease. I have 100% blockage on my right side and 70 or 80% on my left. But I have what's called collateral circulation, which is miraculous. Little tiny blood vessels that do the job as long as I don't try to do something stupid like run a marathon or something like that. So, but they could close down, get clogged by a piece of gunk or something, and I would be dead instantly.
And how long have you been living with that? When was that first diagnosed?
30 years.
So in your 40s?
Yeah.
That was diagnosed.
Yeah.
What other terminal conditions are you currently operating under?
Okay, I have stage 4 prostate cancer, which has a prognosis of, it's terminal, and it has about a 5-year prognosis.
And when did we get the diagnosis?
A couple of years ago.
A couple of years ago.
Yeah. I got the diagnosis of a pulmonary fibrosis, which is another, they don't know where it comes from and how it happens, but it's the scarring of the lung tissue. And the only thing they can try to do is slow down the scarring so it doesn't continue. But it will eventually paralyze my breathing. And I'll be on oxygen, and then it's like any COPD, but it's terminal.
But it's not from smoking or some other bad habit that you had in your life.
No, it may be a reward, not a punishment.
But because you're not a smoker.
No, I'm not a smoker. Never. I smoked a pipe for a little while, but that was not extended or extensive. It was just an occasional.
But both of your parents were smokers.
Both of my parents were smokers.
And some of your children are smokers.
Some of my children are smokers. Those whose mythology allows them to dance on the edge of the darkness can smoke and say, I have diabetes. I have type 2 diabetes.
Adult onset. Classically
onset.
known.
And it wants to just shut me down. So all the medication, all this strategy is supposed to slow it down, but I don't cooperate as well as I should with it. But
because you have a very particular purpose for waking up every day.
I like chocolate donuts. I tell my grandkids I love you a bushel and a peck and a chocolate donut too. They don't really understand how precious a chocolate donut is in my psyche. But that's a very special thing for me. But I'm facing a period here now where I'm finally going to face my monster. My monster's a chocolate donut.
And how do you plan to face that demon?
Cold turkey.
And what's driving that?
Well, I'm the that I don't want to kill myself.
Well, that is a audacious statement by itself.
Yeah, but I'm taking advantage of the religious practice of my faith. I'm Catholic, and Lent is coming up, and it's not about my sin, and all the things that, but it's about the, well, I suppose if you knowingly eat chocolate donuts and you know they're going to kill you, maybe if I keep doing that, I'm committing suicide. What mythology am I?
It's just like every cigarette that somebody smokes.
Yep.
It's just a slow burn type of suicide instead of a high drama, critical moment type.
Right.
Okay, so that's 4. What's the 5th terminal illness that you're dealing with?
Good question.
So you had mentioned your heart condition, your prostate cancer, your pulmonary dysfunction, and the diabetes.
Oh, it's related to the heart condition. I have 2 aortic. They're called embolisms. No, they're not called embolisms. They're called aneurysms.
2 aortic aneurysms, which
Right.
is basically a bleed in your aorta.
Right, it's a swelling in the aorta, and they're calcified, so they're brittle. So at any second, they could just go
And you'll stroke out and
stroke out.
we'll have lost you forever.
Nothing anybody can do.
So that's quite a bit. And being that we're passing this down, going through other diseases within the family on your wife's side, Maria's side, she has a rare form of thyroid cancer, but is otherwise a clean bill of health. But that particular cancer is not winnable.
Yeah, she's a force of nature. Our doctors cannot believe how strong and robust she is, given the condition of her body, because it too is terminal. But she has a mythology of I'm going on whatever it is. She hikes and she walks and she
Lives her life every day.
and she's undaunted by the vagaries of a painful, difficult, complicated life. If you ignore them, then they're not painful, difficult, complicated. They're just a condition. And that's pretty much how she treats it. She's a powerful, mythologically speaking, she's a powerhouse. She's a goddess.
Sure. Well, and we see some parallel perspectives that have translated down into your children. You mentioned that your eldest son, Eric, has some type of an immuno disorder. Your youngest daughter, Erin, also has an immunodeficiency issue. What other health problems are known within the children?
Well, they're primarily they're autoimmune issues.
And so that's something that everyone in the family should be
Yeah.
aware of
Yeah.
and keep in mind.
And that's at a genetic level. But the trouble with you got the genes you got. You can't just change them. But there are ways of stimulating another gene that turns a particular gene off, or it's
But we're building the documentation
yeah.
on future generations and things to be aware of and just discuss to have a full and transparent history. So with that being said, I think that gives us kind of a good insight into what's been going on physically with you. Since you've gotten these multiple diagnoses, with the first one having been 30 years ago, how has that impacted your mental and spiritual journey with each of these subsequent diagnoses, and how has that impacted you?
Primarily, they're just part of the journey. I don't, in terms of spirituality, they're just things that you encounter. I don't, I really don't give them much thought, except the fact that when I get run out of energy and I'm not able to function at any particularly reasonable level, I get weary. But I don't think about, I'm trying to do the acceptance part of acceptance, gratitude, trust. There is gratitude in there too. I am grateful for the heart disease because I have not been as heartfelt a person as I really ought to be. I'm very cerebral. If you don't know about me, that's number one, is I'm more cerebral than emotional.
Yes, affectionate is not, I think, a way that anyone would dare to characterize Chuck.
Well, I can be, and when I get time to think about it. but it's and so I accept. I try to be grateful. I try to trust that I'm going to have the time that I need to see the things to completion that are important to me.
And what are those things that are important to you?
Well, one of them is sitting down with you right now talking about stuff.
And what stuff in particular?
Well, I have, I keep threatening to write another book, but I haven't figured out at this point, maybe this is part of this project, is to help me see my way clear to that.
And what would the fundamental premise of that book be? Where your first book, Soul Solitude, taking time for our spirit to catch up, for your soul to catch up. That's pretty self-apparent as far as what type of information might be contained in that. So, what is that foundational premise of this next book that you're considering?
The power of myth and consciousness is what I'm interested in. Because we're not conscious of the myth that we live. But consciousness is not, nobody understands what consciousness is. But one of the things people don't think about it is being conscious of the myth I'm actually living. Because the thing that I'm talking about is we need to know that we're living a myth. We need to know the myth we're living. We have to decide and choose the myth that we want to live, and then we actually have to live the myth we choose. But if you don't have a fundamental commitment to that my life as myth, that all seems absurd. But I think that's really, if we can all just get used to the fact that life isn't the way we think it is. We like to think of it as being predictable or logical, but there are things that happen that aren't supposed to happen. And the things that are supposed to happen don't always happen. So what do we do to see? This is part of what Mythogenics is all about, is tying this together in a sense of consciousness. And that's not a popular notion, shall we say.
I would not disagree with that, but I think that gives us a wonderful introduction to what the rest of this project is going to be. And I think that gives anyone who's seeing this something real to take away from this particular video and contemplate and mull on and digest. So with your permission, I think we'll wrap this one up right there.
It sounds fine to me. Thank you for doing this.
I'm happy to do it.